Leader Schumer's team know that if he's not here at the start, we'll just assume we'll go in the order of you delivering opening remarks, then to the panelists, and then once he arrives, once whoever is speaking has finished their remarks, you can just recognize him to speak. So then he's got the perfect that.
It will not be good.
Amir, do you want me to wait a minute to start?
I will just move over there and give you a thumbs up. We'll start right at 10.
God, that's stuck to the table. All right. You guys know how to turn on your mics? Very good. You've been trained. It's all good. Good morning. Welcome to all of you, and I want to first of all thank all of our panelists who we're going to hear from today. I want to thank all of our colleagues who will be joining us. Some of them will be coming in and out as the morning goes, but I especially want to thank Senator Schumer, who will be here shortly, as well as Senators Stabenow, Klobuchar, Baldwin, Warren, and Cortez Masto, who are co-hosting this briefing for us. And I again want to thank everyone who is joining us today. I am here ahead of the anniversary of Roe v. Wade to send a message to all the Republicans who spent years crusading to overturn abortion rights and who are now working to ban abortion nationwide. Senate Democrats will not let anyone turn away from the devastation that Republicans have caused, and we will not stop pushing to restore the federal right to abortion. Let's get one thing clear right off the bat. The vast majority of Americans support the right to abortion. They understand that it should be women who are making decisions about their pregnancies, not politicians, not judges. And since Roe was overturned, we have seen that every time abortion rights was on the ballot, abortion rights have won. And tragically, we have also seen with brutal clarity how women have been put in danger and made to suffer because of Republican abortion bans. I have met with providers in Washington State who are overwhelmed and doing their best to keep up with the surge of patients from states like Idaho with strict abortion bans. But that has not stopped Republicans from doubling down on extremism. Anti-choice politicians and activists are still trying to ignore the enormous damage their policies are causing or pretend that it's not their fault. Well, anyone who's actually listening to women and families affected by Republicans' anti-abortion crusade will tell you Republicans' attempts to dodge responsibility for the chaos and trauma they created will not work, because you don't forget the fear of being pregnant when you don't want to be, or the heartbreak of learning a pregnancy is not viable, or the horror of learning it is life-threatening and knowing you are unable to get the care that you need in your state because Republicans forced pregnancy laws. You don't forget being investigated for having a miscarriage or driving your kid across state lines to get an abortion. You don't forget when your doctor tells you they cannot act to save your life because they're afraid of going to jail. And you don't ever forget losing a friend or your wife or your daughter because she couldn't get the care she needed because some politician thought their views were more important than her life. That's not something Republicans can fix with spin or rebranding or by sticking their heads in the sand. This isn't a PR problem for women. It is a living hell and a personal nightmare. Women will not be quiet, and they will not be ignored, certainly not while we have something to say about it. Senate Democrats are going to keep fighting to protect abortion from new Republican attacks, pass legislation like the Women's Health Protection Act to restore and expand abortion rights, and lift up the voices and stories of people across the country who are suffering as a result of Republicans' cruelty. And that's why we are here today. And I really appreciate everyone who's joining us today to make sure that these incredibly important stories are told. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to share what their personal life has been like. And I'm going to start with Dr. Dennard, who's come here with a really critical story that all of us need to understand and hear. So thank you so much. We'll start with you.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you guys hear me okay? Thank you so much for having me. My name's Austin Dennard. I'm a mother of 3, an OBGYN, and a 6th-generation Texan. I am here to speak about my own lived experiences with abortion bans in my home state and the chaos, harm, and heartbreak that these laws have caused my patients, my profession, me personally as well. Like for many people, my journey to motherhood has not been straightforward. I have 3 healthy children, but I've also experienced 3 pregnancy losses. One of my losses ended in miscarriage, while the other 2 ended in abortion, following devastating yet different fetal diagnoses. The first time I needed an abortion, it was 2019. My husband and I were newlyweds, and I was finishing my residency training in obstetrics and gynecology. It was our first pregnancy, and we were so thrilled. Then we received terrible news. A rare genetic disorder, a horrible diagnosis. My pregnancy immediately became high risk. And I'll never forget the tight hug that my maternal fetal medicine specialist gave me after our ultrasound. Together, we cried. Then she openly discussed my options for care. She was not afraid to tell me that I needed an abortion. My husband and I drove home that day absolutely heartbroken, while my doctor began arranging care with a medical team she knew and trusted. Despite my grief, I did feel safe and supported. And less than a week later, I received an uncomplicated abortion from a highly skilled physician just 10 miles away from my home in Texas. And my recovery was expedited by loving and supportive colleagues, family, and friends. Then fast forward to the summer of 2022. Roe had fallen and everything had changed. We now had 2 young children, a girl and a boy, just 20 months apart, and we were really hoping for a third. I had recently experienced a miscarriage, but was again thrilled to be pregnant for the 5th time. Then a routine ultrasound showed devastating news. The brain and skull had not formed. It was anencephaly, the most severe neural tube diagnosis. Although relatively rare, this is fatal. The pregnancy was not going to become a brother or sister for my children. And I remember looking at the ultrasound screen in complete disbelief. I can't believe I need another abortion, I thought. We have to flee the state. My state, 6th-generation Texan, where I practice medicine, where I'm raising my family. Then my doctor gave me a hug. "I'm so sorry," was all she was able to say. My home state had stripped me of my own reproductive rights while simultaneously disassembling the most important foundation of a doctor-patient relationship: trust and open, honest communication. My mind began to spin. Where am I going to go? Who is going to take care of me? Who will take care of my children when I'm gone? What about my patients? What if this is the last time I ever get to be pregnant? Because of Texas's new laws, we were afraid to use a credit card or tell people where we were going so suddenly to the East Coast, for fear that our ability to practice medicine would be compromised. It was absolutely humiliating, and I felt physically and emotionally broken. As an OBGYN, I know firsthand that everyone's reason for needing an abortion is valid and personal. Even planned, prayed-for pregnancies can end in abortion. I have seen abortion save lives. And for me, the physical and emotional risk of carrying a pregnancy to term, one that had no chance of survival, was just something I could not fathom. But since the fall of Roe, abortions that were written by politicians, abortion laws written by politicians, not by doctors, had made the decision for me. So long as I remained on Texas soil, I was to remain pregnant. Forced pregnancy, forced delivery, forced to watch him die, either in my womb or in my arms. I have felt so marginalized and silenced by these laws, and that is why I am here to speak out today, not only for myself, but for my young daughter and for all of my patients. We no longer have the basic human rights for freedom and self-determination that my mother and her generation relied on for nearly 50 years. The state of Texas should not be making these decisions for me or for anyone else. Nothing brings me more joy than raising my children, 4, 3, and now 5 months, right over there with my husband. But a close second is getting to be an OBGYN. I get to be there for all of those change your life forever kind of moments. Congratulations, you're pregnant. It's a boy, it's twins. There's just nothing like the moment that a baby is born and a family is created. But with those moments come difficult ones as well. Ones of heartbreak, pregnancy loss, devastating diagnoses, infertility. And since Roe has fallen, those tough moments have become even more tragic, and they're adding enormous fear onto all of the sadness, including new painful questions I routinely have to face as a Texas provider. How can I help her? Where can we get her care? How do I keep her safe? What if she's traveling amidst a medical emergency? These bans have stolen so much joy. So now, when I deliver a baby and I place it on my patient's chest, I take a huge sigh of relief that the three of us have somehow beaten the odds. In spite of everything that is thrown in front of us, we have brought that baby into the world safely and to its parents' arms. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dennard. I so appreciate you telling that personal story, and the fact that generations of women before only had to share that with their families, not with the world, is not lost on me. I so appreciate you coming and sharing it, because we need to make sure that that does not continue to happen in this country. So thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to turn to Dr. Floyd.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, there we go. So good morning, everyone, and thank you to Senator Murray, to Leader Schumer, Senators Stabenow, Klobuchar, Baldwin, Warren, Cortez Masto, and distinguished members of the Democratic caucus. My name is Dr. Serina Floyd. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a board-certified OBGYN. I am a fellow with Physicians for Reproductive Health, and I am the Chief Medical Officer at Planned Parenthood of Metropolitan, Washington, D.C. I have been providing comprehensive reproductive health care for over 20 years, and I am proud to be an abortion provider serving this community right here in Washington, D.C. I am here today to make clear that abortion is essential care. I can say without hesitation that I have saved people's lives by providing abortion care. It is a critical part of my work as an OBGYN, work that has become increasingly challenging to do in this country. We are approaching 2 years since the Dobbs decision overturned 50 years of precedent and removed the constitutional protections around abortion care. And the devastating consequences are being felt every day for countless individuals, families, communities, and providers across the U.S. We Count is a study being conducted by the Society of Family Planning, which analyzes the shifts in volume of patients seeking abortion since the Dobbs decision took effect. This study has overwhelming spikes of people accessing cares in places with fewer restrictions on abortion care. These spikes are likely the result of tireless efforts by providers, health centers, abortion funds, and advocates to meet the demand of those needing to travel for abortions. We Count tells us the numbers, but what it does not share are the stories behind the numbers, the significant mental, emotional, financial, and social burdens of those traveling for care. Just last week, I cared for a patient with one of those stories, a woman I'll call Nina, forced to travel to Washington, D.C. from North Carolina for her abortion. Nina was traveling by bus, and after missing her first bus, caught the next one but arrived in D.C. too late for her appointment. She was rescheduled for the following day and then was asked where she would be staying overnight. Nina's response was that she had just researched on her cell phone several homeless shelters in the area and had located one 15 minutes away from our center that she was going to try. Nina had no money, not for a hotel, not for food, for nothing. All she had was her bus ticket home. Nina's story is one of the many I could tell, each and every one disturbing and heartbreaking. Guttmacher data revealed last month that 1 in 5 patients now travel out of state for abortion. But what about the people for whom abortion bans or increased restrictions have proven impossible to navigate? The most recent We Count analysis shows that in states with abortion bans, abortion care provided within those medical systems has virtually disappeared, forcing thousands of people to remain pregnant. We know both from research and from reality what it means when someone is denied the abortion they need, know of the mental, emotional, physical, and economic impacts of those denials. Evidence shows that women denied abortion care are more likely to experience serious medical conditions during the end of pregnancy, more likely to remain in violent relationships, and are more likely to experience economic hardships and financial insecurity. Systemic racism and economic injustice have translated into enormous failures of the U.S. healthcare and economic systems to meet the needs of minoritized and marginalized individuals. This has resulted in a disproportionate shouldering of the burden of restrictive laws and abortion bans on people of color, those with low incomes, young people, LGBTQ+ persons, rural communities, migrants and immigrants, those with disabilities, and those experiencing incarceration. The impacts on these communities are and always have been the absolute greatest. This constantly changing legal landscape is untenable, and the threats continue to build. Providers around the country are navigating the fallout, not just for their patients, but also for themselves and their teams. In access areas, we are grappling with increased demand, high patient loads, long hours, and at times more complicated care. My colleagues in ban states are coping with the blatant disregard and disrespect of their patients' bodily agency, but also with the loss of the ability to practice the medicine they love, and that in many cases contributes to their very identity. The effects aren't felt only by abortion providers. Practitioners of various medical disciplines, OBGYN, emergency medicine, primary care, are being forced to question whether they can provide care in line with their medical judgment and expertise. They are being made to ignore medical guidelines and are being forced to delay life-saving medical care in direct opposition to the oaths to which we are sworn. Providers and their teams are attempting to make sense of confusing and ambiguous laws while managing the fear and anxiety of possible criminalization just for doing our jobs. These frustrations are not only negatively impacting those in practice, but are also creating ramifications for future workforce capacity. Whether a provider contemplating leaving their current practice due to legal constraints, or a resident reconsidering where they will accept a job after completing training, or a student thinking hard about whether or not to practice medicine at all. The results of the Dobbs decision are directly influencing clinician availability in a country that already has dire provider shortages. I know abortion is necessary, compassionate, essential health care, and that my patients are capable of making complex, thoughtful decisions about their health and lives. I am unwavering in my commitment to support them as they do so. I urge you to listen to the stories of people who provide and access abortion care. I hope these stories help you understand that abortion care is not an isolated political issue, but rather an issue of basic humanity. Thank you for having me today, and I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Floyd, thank you so much for sharing with us. I really appreciate it. We've been joined by the Majority Leader, Senator Chuck Schumer, and before we turn to our last witness, I would like to turn it over to Chuck.
Well, thank you, Senator Murray, Patty, and thank you for your amazing leadership on this issue, and I thank all of my colleagues. Our caucus has stood strong in support of Roe v. Wade, and the anniversary of Roe v. Wade should be a joyous day for our country, a day when the Supreme Court decided to value a woman's right to privacy and her own autonomy. And for nearly 50 years, this landmark case was the law of the land. But for decades, the far right has led a campaign to systematically dismantle a woman's fundamental right to choose. The most extreme elements of the Republican Party have made it their mission to eliminate this freedom of choice. The most extreme elements of the Republican Party have done this repeatedly over and over again. They've made it their mission. And in 2022, tragically, alarmingly, and outrageously, they succeeded when a hard right 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court voted to overturn Roe v. Wade. For over a year and a half now, we've had to live with the calamitous Dobbs decision, as we have heard from our witnesses. It's opened up the floodgates for draconian and cruel bans on women's choice across America. Republican abortion bans around the country have led to chaos and irreparable harm. There are thousands and thousands of stories that we'll never know of the harm caused by this ruling. And they have put hard-right Republican politicians, mostly male, in charge of women's personal health care decisions. I am honored to stand with my Democratic colleagues and say that we will never, never stop fighting for a woman's right to choose. We will never stop fighting to take back these rights from the far-right extremists who want to impose their views on a country that overwhelmingly does not agree with them. The anti-choice activists who will descend on Washington DC on January 19th should know that they are a shrinking minority in America. Every year, they're shrinking and have less and less weight with the American people. Democrats cannot and will not accept this new status quo. We will never stop fighting to take back the rights from these far-right extremists when America overwhelmingly disagrees with them. When the MAGA Supreme Court signaled the end of Roe and declared that there was no constitutional right to an abortion, it meant that our children will now grow up, unfortunately, in a world with fewer liberties than previous generations. My granddaughter will have fewer rights than her grandmother. The effects were instantaneous and devastating. 1 in 3 women lost abortion access, and we know this has had a disproportionate effect on certain Americans more than others. Rural and low-income Americans, people of color, members of the LGBTQ community, particularly the trans community and Black Americans. The far right has shown they want to force this on the entirety of the country. They won't stop until they have enacted a federal abortion law. But again, let me repeat it. The people who come down here on the 19th are a shrinking minority. They don't represent very much of America. The American people have told us time and time again that they reject this extreme MAGA agenda. They have voted against it at the ballot box in midterms, even in states where people never expected there was a pro-choice majority, and marched in support of access by the thousands. They've rallied time and time again in support of access to abortion as more cases wind their way through the courts. And now there are cases in Texas, thank you, in Idaho, in New Mexico, to name a few. There are cases coming up before the Supreme Court looking at access to mifepristone and a hospital's obligation to provide life-saving abortion care. Every day the legal landscape gets more complicated, and it's leaving the women of America in the lurch. But Democrats will fight tooth and nail to stop that from happening. We will not relent. We will not give up. We know that history is on our side. Yesterday we celebrated, or today's Wednesday, Monday we celebrated MLK Day, and he said that the arc of justice is long, the arc of history is long, but it bends in the direction of justice. We will win justice for the women of America. We will bend that arc of history. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader Schumer. And now we will turn to Ms. Valenti.
Thank you, Senator Murray. Good morning. My name is Jessica Valenti, and since Roe was overturned, I've been documenting the harms caused by abortion bans in a newsletter called Abortion Every Day. I cover everything from legislation and court battles to anti-abortion strategy and language, but the topic that I find myself writing about most, I'm sorry to say, is suffering. And while Americans know about some of the suffering caused by abortion bans, thanks to the bravery of women like Dr. Dennard, there are hundreds of other stories that go unreported. I have spoken to a 21-year-old woman in Texas who was denied an abortion even though her fetus developed without a head, and a hospital worker in South Carolina who watched a college student die after attempting to end her own pregnancy. I get more messages every day than I could ever possibly answer. And while I could share stories that would shock and sicken you in the way that I am shocked and sickened every single day doing this work, I wanted to use my time here to stress that this incredible suffering, this cruelty that treats American women as less than human, is all by design. Despite Republican assurances that cases like Dr. Dennard's are the result of legislative growing pains or doctors simply not understanding the law, despite claims that their bans just need to be tweaked or clarified, I want to make clear that all of this pain and suffering was not just expected, it was planned for. Anti-abortion lawmakers and activists would have voters believe that they had no idea that this is what post-Roe America would look like. But they had 50 years to plan for this moment, and they made that plan carefully, strategically, and callously. Every raped child forced to give birth, every cancer patient denied care, and every woman arrested after having a miscarriage was accounted for and strategized over. But with Americans getting angrier and angrier at what abortion bans are doing to their families and communities, Republicans are desperate to hide that truth from voters. They need us to believe that they're not the cruel extremists that their laws show them to be. And they certainly don't want us to know that they planned for women's deaths in the same way they strategize over a talking point or a poll. And I mean that literally. For months, I have been tracking a conservative campaign to sow distrust in maternal mortality numbers. Republicans know that the data is going to show that their laws kill women, so they're preemptively claiming that maternal death numbers aren't accurate. Some states have even disbanded their maternal death review committees entirely, and because the people most likely to die are the most marginalized among us, their hope is that no one will care. I've also documented how the anti-abortion movement laid the groundwork over months to blame doctors for women's deaths, as if the people working under threat of losing their license or jail time are the problem, and not the laws that prevent them from doing their jobs. All of which is to say, when Republicans feign surprise or compassion over post-Roe horror stories, they are lying. They knew that women would suffer and die as a result of their laws. They decided it was a trade-off worth making, and everything they've done since Roe was overturned has been in service of hiding that fact. Most of those lies are hiding in plain sight. When Republicans tell Americans that the national 15-week ban they're proposing is a reasonable middle ground, they leave out the fact that the law would force women to carry non-viable pregnancies to term. Their compromise would do to any American capable of pregnancy what Texas tried to do to Kate Cox. And again, this is not an oversight. It is a deliberate part of a much broader extremist strategy. Right now, there is a quiet but well-funded campaign led by the most powerful anti-abortion groups in the country that is focused entirely on pressuring and forcing women to carry doomed pregnancies to term. They're not only trying to do away with exceptions for non-viable pregnancies, they're trying to eradicate prenatal testing altogether. It's a lot easier to force women to carry a dying fetus to term if they never get diagnosed to begin with. When I tell people about this, the question I get asked most often is why? Why would anyone want to deliberately create a world where women are forced to be walking coffins? It is inexplicable until you understand that this has nothing to do with families or babies, but enforcing a worldview that says it's women's job to be pregnant and to stay pregnant, no matter what the cost or consequence. But because Republicans don't have the bravery to admit that truth, and because they're afraid of voters who are more pro-choice than ever, they lie. They talk about compassion because they know that their laws are cruel. They use the word consensus while passing bans that voters don't want. And they call Democrats extremists while fighting for the right to deny women life-saving abortions in emergency rooms. And because Republicans know that voters overwhelmingly oppose their bans, they claim to be softening on abortion by pushing one of the biggest lies in abortion politics, exceptions. Again and again, Republicans deliberately propose and pass exceptions that no one will ever qualify for. The only purpose they serve is to allow extremist lawmakers to feign moderation or pretend as if they've conceded something. And frankly, any Republican who claims that exceptions are real should have to do so in front of all the people who've been told that they do not qualify for care, even as they went septic or had their uteruses removed. They should have to defend themselves in front of women like Kate Cox and Dr. Dennard, or Brittany Watts, who wasn't just denied care by a religious hospital when her water broke too early for her pregnancy to survive, but was arrested when she miscarried at home. The only Republican exception that holds an iota of truth is the one about women's lives, though not in the way that they think. When you look at any Republican life of the mother exception, they all contain a caveat. And that caveat says, that women whose lives are at risk can be given abortions, unless the risk is because she's suicidal. And I want to stress how telling that is. Republicans know that forcing people to be pregnant against their will make them want to kill themselves. And they enshrined into law that they don't care. In a moment when we are hearing so many extreme horror stories, it can be difficult, I think, to get back to that foundational cruelty, that to force someone to be pregnant against their will for any reason at any point causes profound existential harm. Abortion is healthcare, but it is also freedom. That's why every abortion denied is a tragedy, and increasingly Americans understand that. They don't want the government involved in their decisions about pregnancy at any point. The first time I came to DC was in 1992. I was 13 years old, and my mother brought me here for the pro-choice March for Women's Lives. Maybe some of you were there. I remember men screaming at us from the sidelines, and I remember how confused I was over why they hated us so much. Today, my 13-year-old daughter is in the room, and it's her first time in Washington, and yet somehow she's here with less rights than I had 32 years ago. And I think that we should be ashamed of that. My deepest hope is that she doesn't need to follow in the steps of her mother and grandmother and come here decades from now to defend her daughter's humanity. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. We're going to turn to a discussion, and I'll recognize senators as they arrived. I will ask some questions, but Senator Schumer, do you want to?
I just wanted to thank you. That was powerful movement.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll open with a question, and I first again want to thank all of you for traveling here, for being here, for sharing your personal stories, and being willing to discuss this with all of us. I wanted to ask each one of you if you could just tell us what is something you think people do not understand about the state of abortion care in America right now. And Dr. Floyd, I'll start with you, and we'll just go down the panel. But what do you think people don't understand about abortion care today?
Thank you, Senator Murray, for that question. I think what people truly do not understand is that even though this country is now in an abortion care crisis post-Roe, this country was never where it needed to be before Roe even fell. With Roe, people still did not have their right to control their bodies and hence their destinies. They didn't have that respected. With Roe, patients' address still determined whether or not they could have access to life-saving care. And with Roe, politicians were not prevented from entering my exam room and interfering with decisions made by my patients and I. So what I feel like is not really clearly understood by many is that while Roe offered us some protections, Roe was always the floor. It was always the floor, not the ceiling. And right now, what this country needs to address the state of abortion care is so much more than what Roe gave us when it was in existence.
Thank you. Dr. Dennard.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Floyd. I think that's a great comment. I think also if people don't realize that if you have the capacity to become pregnant, you have the capacity to need an abortion. And right now, abortion in our country is becoming extinct. It's basic medical care that any person needs to be able to receive, and it's quickly slipping through our fingers.
Ms. Valenti?
I don't think people realize or understand how horrified Americans are by what is happening right now. I think when you go to a newspaper, you go to a mainstream news article, you would get the impression that the country is evenly split on abortion rights, that it's something that we're, polarized over. And that's just not true. We know that's not true. We know that the vast majority of voters want abortion to be legal. There was a Washington Post ABC News poll that showed 80% of Americans, nearly 80%, wanted that decision to be between a patient and their doctor. This is about a small group of extremist legislators imposing their will on the vast majority of voters who do not want these bans. And I think the more that we can talk about that and talk about this as a democracy issue as well as a healthcare and freedom issue, the better off that we'll be.
Right, and I agree, and I think one of the things we all need to understand is that everybody wants a healthy, happy pregnancy and assumes that will happen to them, never knowing that the possibility exists for every woman that it won't be, and they need that kind of care available when it is needed. I'm going to go around the room and let people ask questions, and I'm going to start with Senator Baldwin, who was here at the beginning. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Senator Murray. Thank you so much for convening us today. And I want to thank our panelists. I have rarely heard more powerful testimony. Thank you. Before I get to questions, I just wanted to reflect on the upcoming anniversary of Roe versus Wade. Almost 51 years ago, the Supreme Court correctly decided that every American has the right to make their own health care decisions and respected a right of privacy. Before 2022, there were generations of women who had only known an America with the right to abortion care. But when the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, it didn't just set Americans back nearly 50 years. It sent women in Wisconsin, where I represent, back to an 1849 statute banning abortions. That predates the Civil War, 70 years before women would have the right to vote, so they certainly weren't in the chambers crafting these policies. As all of you can imagine, that 1849 near-total criminal ban on abortion, which only allowed exceptions to save the life of the mother, and your powerful testimony, Ms. Valenti, shows us how inadequate those are. It had immediate ramifications for Wisconsin women and their doctors. One woman in Wisconsin bled for more than 10 days from an incomplete miscarriage after emergency room staff refused to treat her because they feared they would be criminally prosecuted for providing care. I heard stories of women just like you, Dr. Dennard, who had learned their pregnancies were unviable. But instead of receiving care and beginning their grieving process, they were forced to find appropriate appointments out of state and make travel plans instead of grieving. Thankfully, in Wisconsin, we have taken in recent months important steps to restore abortion services at 3 locations across the state. However, those clinics have been seen just overwhelming demand for appointments. With just 3 clinics offering abortion care statewide, access to comprehensive reproductive care for many Wisconsinites still means driving hours, taking time off work, arranging childcare, and women are still subject to onerous state statutory requirements like a 24-hour waiting period and mandatory ultrasounds before receiving the care they need. The reality of post-Roe America has been dire. It's endangered women, it's hamstrung doctors who just want to care for their patients, and it's infringed the rights, the basic rights of Americans who are just trying to make their own health care decisions. Oftentimes, issues before Congress require complex solutions that take time to implement and solve. With restoring access to abortion care, we have as close to a legislative silver bullet as it gets, and that's our Women's Health Protection Act. Our Women's Health Protection Act, which I am proud to lead, would guarantee doctors the freedom to provide abortion care and give patients the ability to receive the abortion care they need everywhere across the country. It would stop states from imposing arbitrary and medically unnecessary restrictions that jeopardize access to abortion, including rolling back these restrictions that were in place prior to the Dobbs decision, and 2 of which I just described in Wisconsin, a 24-hour waiting period and mandatory ultrasounds before receiving care. I'm committed to fight to regain these rights and freedoms that Wisconsin women have lost, and proud to partner with so many in this room to advocate for the Women's Health Protection Act. So 2 questions. First, for all of our speakers, can you talk about why rolling back these medically unnecessary restrictions that that states and localities have passed on abortion is so important and goes hand in hand with restoring the protections of Roe versus Wade if we want every woman to be able to get the care they deserve? Let's start with you, Ms. Valenti.
Sure. I would say that I think I would love to see us move beyond restoring Roe and building something stronger and better and more protective than Roe did, but it is really clear. I cover this every day. A lot of people who are on this issue are seeing this every day, that these restrictions need to be ended urgently, that every single day someone is being harmed. There are people who are dying. We are not hearing about their stories in the media because, understandably, families do not want their loved ones' names to be forever attached to this issue, or they're concerned about being harassed or being the subject of constant media inquiry. But the suffering is happening every single day, and it's so important that we do something. I mean, I think what's so hard, and Dr. Dennard and anyone who is seeing patients would say the same thing. It's difficult. We can talk about this politically and what needs to happen, but it's also really difficult when you're hearing from individual patients and individual people who just on a day-to-day basis just want to be able to go and get the care that they need. And so to me, this is a state of emergency, and it sort of shocks me when people don't treat it like that.
I agree 100%. It's a conversation that I now have with my patients in the office every day. Every day for me and my profession is affected by these restrictions. And if we can move forward and become pro-family again and pro-women again, then this enormous amount of fear that we feel as providers in states like Texas, and the enormous amount of fear that families have. I have patients that are afraid to start trying to get pregnant and start their families. I have patients who are afraid to have siblings for their children. It's really taken so much joy out of what should be an enormously joyful chapter in someone's life.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Floyd.
Yeah, I think, I'll say something again that I mentioned in my remarks, which is that abortions save lives. I mean, plain and simple. When you do not have restrictions, when you do not have laws, when you do not have policies that are preventing you from getting the absolute necessary care that you need, then you live, you survive, and you thrive. We know that having access to abortion changes destinies. I cannot tell you how many patients I've seen, how many people I know who talk about how their abortion has allowed them to continue their education, to take a job that they otherwise would not have been able to have, to be able to take care of family members that they otherwise would not have been able to take care of. So abortion is so important that I don't want to understate just how, the magnitude of the effect of not having that access, what that means to people in their everyday lives and in their futures.
The other quick question for Dr. Floyd and Dr. Dennard. You talked about needing to travel to get the care you need. For some, as you described so powerfully, Dr. Floyd, that is nearly out of reach because of finances. A number of us introduced the Reproductive Health Travel Fund Act to help with travel-related funds. I know that's only a piece of it, but what do we know about the impact that being forced to travel far from home for health care has had on patients and families?
Yeah, I guess I'll go first. The impact has been severe. It's been significant. I told you one story, but as I said, I have many other stories that I can tell about folks who have traveled. I practice here in D.C., and our health center, we see patients that come from all over, Oklahoma, from Georgia, from Florida, from Texas. We see patients who come from all over. And what it takes for some patients to be able to make that trip, some individuals don't have any understanding of that. If you are someone with means, if you are someone with privilege, if you are someone with resources, you don't quite understand what it means when you have to use the last of the money that you have that you would have otherwise used to pay your rent or your light bill or to buy groceries for your family, when you have to use the last of that money to be able to arrange transportation, when you have to figure out what am I going to do with my children because I can't take them with me, or when you do have to take them with you and you have to figure out what am I going to do with them while I'm traveling and while I'm having my abortion. When people have to figure out places to stay, when they have to figure out what are we going to eat, when they have to figure out how am I going to get to the health center from wherever I may be staying while I'm traveling. Those are significant burdens, significant burdens. And again, for someone who has resources, navigating those burdens are a little bit easier, but for someone without resources, they're insurmountable, which is why you have people who are being forced to remain pregnant. I do want to highlight, though, that even for someone with resources, the mental and the emotional toll is major. Dr. Dennard shared that already. You're not in a place where you're able to be supported by your community, by your family, by your loved ones. You're having to go places where you may never have been and be seen by people you don't even know. And so, beyond just, beyond the importance of the resources that are needed to make that travel, there's also the mental and the emotional toll that it takes on people to have to do that.
Yeah, I've said this many times, and I'll say it again. I am the best case scenario, right? I am a OBGYN. I'm a Caucasian married woman with resources. I have an enormous amount of privilege, and it's my privilege that helped me get my abortion. I remember thinking, what do you pack when you're traveling for an abortion? And thinking to myself, I can't believe I'm even having to ask this question. Logistically, traveling is incredibly difficult, even despite privilege. Thousands of dollars, family support, childcare, abandoning my patients, being able to have supportive colleagues who could take care of them while I was gone, and for my husband as well. I am the exception to the rule, and it's absolutely my privilege that was that resulted in me getting the life-saving and standard medical care that I needed.
If I could just add something, this is why access to abortion medication is so important for people who don't necessarily need procedural abortions. We've seen folks in red states who need abortion care are getting that medication shipped to them, and we're grateful that they're able to do that. But that's the reason that we're seeing so many attacks on mifepristone, on the ability to ship, mail abortion medication, and this fear of the Comstock Act. And so I think that is very much top of mind when it comes to ideas about traveling and access as well.
Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Oh, I don't think this is working. Can you hear me okay? First of all, I cannot thank you all enough for being here. This is not an easy thing to do, and using your voices and your advocacy is going to help us. This is key to continuing to promote the issues that are important for women and how we make this change. Let me just say, I come from a state of Nevada. It's a proud pro-choice state. Voters overwhelmingly support a woman's right to choose in the state of Nevada. That's men, women, Republicans, Democrats, independents, all of the above. And yet we are still now dealing with a challenge across this country where there are elected representatives who want to take that away. It's astounding to me, and I just came from CES, the Consumer Electronics Show in Nevada, because there's new technology out there that is going to help healthcare, that is actually going to bring access and affordability to so many, including women. Yet there are elected representatives across this country who want to limit women's access to 21st century healthcare. It's astounding to me. There's elected representatives who cloak themselves in the Constitution, who clutch the Bible, and pass laws to take away women's freedom and make them suffer, and their families. And to me, this is just an outrageous time for us to see elected representatives. I don't understand how Americans can be so cruel to other Americans and think it's okay to take away women's rights in this country and then challenge them when they have the audacity to come forward, be emotional about it, and stand with their family that this is so important. We need these rights. So I can't thank you enough, because our voices are key at this moment in time, not just for now, but the future, as you've seen with your children. So here's what I do know, and we've touched a little bit about this. This is what I see happening in Nevada and across the country. It's not just about these extreme politicians going after abortion. They are stopping women from traveling out of state to healthcare. For healthcare, they're trying to criminalize women. They're trying to criminalize the doctors for helping women who travel out of state. They're coming after birth control, as we've just heard. They're coming after mifepristone and the right to get that abortion, that medicated abortion. The Supreme Court's going to decide whether banning abortion in emergency rooms and restricting access to the abortion pill, mifepristone, is okay. They are literally proposing legislation, some of my colleagues, to ban abortion nationally. We've seen this time and time again. And so ringing the bell about not just the issue around abortion, but everything around women's rights when it comes to our reproductive freedom is on the line right now. And I can't thank you enough for being here. Dr. Floyd, let me ask you this, because the most recent thing now that is happening, as you know, in the 1980s, Congress passed the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, EMTALA. You both know EMTALA very well, to ensure that no matter the circumstances, people could get life-stabilizing care in an emergency room. Can you talk about the threat to emergency care created by states going after EMTALA, like in the EMTALA case before the Supreme Court, Idaho versus United States? Because now even a woman who has issues and challenges around her health care when it comes to a birth of a child now may not even have the ability to get that emergency care. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of that case?
Yeah, I mean, any legislation around removing the protections of EMTALA is absolutely dangerous. And it brings to mind, Ms. Valenti used a very an expression that I thought was very fitting when she used the term walking coffin. It really is driving home the fact that individuals capable of pregnancy are strictly, their sole purpose is to be able to carry that pregnancy and no other purpose. Mm-hmm. And the fact that you would deny someone emergency care that could save their life makes no sense, right? If the idea is to be able to promote life, like, that is counterintuitive, because now this person, the life of the pregnant person is potentially going to be lost, as well as any potential for any future possibility to have children. So whether it's, loss of the mother's life or loss of the mother's fertility, or loss of their health in such a way that they become debilitated and not able to go on to function the way that they had been functioning previously. It's terrifying. It is terrifying for patients, but it's also terrifying for providers because, again, we're put in this position of trying to decide or having to wait for a hospital administrator or a hospital lawyer or having, to wait for some external body to tell us that the medicine that we took many, many years learning to practice, we have to set that aside.
Yeah.
And it's devastating. I mean, I have colleagues who I know who've been in that situation where they have literally had their hands tied and not been able to provide care that they knew was going to be absolutely paramount to being able to save a patient's life. And yet we're told, nope, you can't do that.
Right, thank you. And can I just have Ms. Valenti follow up? Because this is a perfect example of how they're using every opportunity to challenge the laws that are out there to help women and undermining them. I mean, EMTAL is a federal law, and now they're trying to say that the states rights preempt federal law in this case.
Well, they're showing their cards very clearly, right? I mean, you couldn't be more clear than fighting against the ability to give someone an emergency life-saving abortion. And I think what is so difficult to watch is, these legislators who say, well, our state law takes care of that. Like, it's fine. People will get the life-saving care that they need. But the proof is in the pudding, right? Like, we are hearing stories every single day where that's not the case, where people are going septic. And so we know that pregnancy is too complicated to legislate. We see it with every new horror story that comes out. And I think when Republicans make clear that they don't care about our lives, we should believe them and listen to them.
Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Murray, and I'm not sure this is working here. There we go. Thank you so much for bringing us together and for all of your powerful testimony. I mean, and Dr. Dennard, I'm so sorry. I mean, I keep sitting here thinking, is this 1824 or 2024? I mean, what the heck is going on here? And unfortunately, Ms. Valenti, you've spelled it out in a very scary way. I want to just add one thing to what Senator Cortez Masto said in terms of the breadth of this and the shocking way that all of this about women's health, children, and so on. As Senator Murray knows, as the head of Appropriations Committee, we're having trouble getting WIC fully funded, which is prenatal care and healthy food and baby formula and support for babies, newborn babies, getting the full funding we need. Right now, we're in a position where we may end up in waiting lists because there's not enough money for WIC, and the pregnancy is only 9 months. How do you do a waiting list? But that is, it's like they want us, to have the babies, but aren't even willing to invest in them being healthy. It is just shocking to me. So we know what happened 2 years ago when the Supreme Court ripped away our fundamental freedom to make our own reproductive health care decisions. I want to speak about, for a moment, and get your reaction to what came next in a number of places. Michigan, 2022, we did the petitions, signatures, we got a ballot proposal in the Michigan Constitution to protect our reproductive freedoms. And it was overwhelmingly supported. In fact, it brought out the largest voter turnout in a non-presidential year ever for Michigan. We had the last people standing in line and voting past midnight. They think we're okay. They think because we have this in the Michigan Constitution now and the other states that have it, that we're not affected by a national abortion ban. And the horror story is after all the work we've done in Michigan, all the work we've done with what Wisconsin's doing, what other states are doing, stepping up and getting the right information, the protections into our own constitutions, a national abortion ban takes all that away. And I really believe and would appreciate, I'm going to start, Dr. Floyd, with just your comments on what a national abortion ban being put forward by Republicans, and I believe that they're back in charge, I mean, that's where it's going, national abortion ban. So that all the work that we are doing in the states where you can go to, forget it. It will all be gone. And I think, to me, this is the ultimate focus in terms of what we need to be paying attention to. But Dr. Floyd, would you want to comment at all how you see a national abortion ban affecting all of this?
Yes, we already see kind of what it would look like, right? Like when you look at states like Mississippi and Texas and Alabama and Louisiana. I mean, when you look at these states that already have bans, like that's what we'd be looking at on a national level. That is what we would see. We would see again worsening maternal health outcomes. We already know that maternal mortality in this country is abysmal. I mean, it is absolutely horrific how it is, the levels of maternal morbidity and mortality in this country. And having access to abortion care is directly related to the ability for individuals to go on to have healthy lives and healthy pregnancies in the future. So we will see worsening situations of worsening maternal morbidity and mortality. In general, as was said, pregnancy is a natural process, and I don't want to give the impression that all pregnancies are dangerous, because that's not the case, but we absolutely know that for a good number of folks out there, pregnancies are dangerous. They absolutely are dangerous, which is why the maternal mortality and morbidity rates look the way that they do. I think it's, we are already dealing with, as I mentioned in my remarks, provider shortages. And so when it comes to being able to train our providers and how to deliver the care that they need to be able to deliver, when they don't have access to being able to provide the procedures that teach them how to provide that care, then there's a loss in terms of how we're able to train our future providers. So, I mean, that's just like the tip of the iceberg of what potentially we would see. But as I said, you just have to look to the states that currently have bans to see what we would see on a national level.
If I could
Yes,
add
please.
something. I think what's so distressing to me, in addition to the possibility of a national ban, is that Republicans don't need to pass a national ban in order to have the kind of impact that a national ban would have. If they're successful in their attacks on mifepristone, over 50% of people who end their pregnancies do so with abortion medication. If they're successful in using the Comstock Act so that you can't ship abortion medication, ship tools for abortion, that impact will be largely indistinguishable from a national abortion ban. And that is what I'm so afraid of, that Americans don't understand the danger there as well.
Could you speak just a little bit more about mifepristone? And we know the case before the Supreme Court and so on, but people don't necessarily recognize over half of the abortions are medicine abortions, and what the landscape's going to look like depending on what the court does.
Right. That doesn't just make a difference, no matter what state you are in, availability of abortion medication will have a tremendous impact on you. If you're talking about pro-choice states, if all of a sudden pro-choice states don't have access to abortion medication, then already overwhelmed, overloaded doctors who are seeing patients from out of state will be even more so. The waiting lists, which are already long, will get even longer. As I said, we're already in the middle of a national healthcare crisis when it comes to abortion access. I think once you take mifepristone, abortion medication, off the table, that gets exponentially scarier and worse, because so many people in red states have been able to get the abortion care they needed by using abortion medication, by having it shipped to them from doctors in pro-choice states with shield laws. And so it's terrifying, honestly.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator Murray.
Thank you. Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Senator Murray. I want to thank you for hosting this brief today, and Dr. Floyd, Dr. Dennard, Ms. Valenti, thank you for taking your time and willingness to share your expertise in this way. As all of us know, it's flat out wrong that we have to come here to discuss these real-world impacts of rights being taken away from Americans. 51 years ago, the Roe decision established a clear and consistent legal right to the access to health care. And this is especially important in states like my own, in Arizona, where abortions have been completely banned based on an 1864 law before Arizona was even a territory, not before it was a state. That's what we're dealing with in Arizona. So for those 51 years, Roe allowed Arizonans to make their own decision. But as we've all discussed, the Dobbs decision was a giant leap backwards. And here's what this looks like in Arizona. So women in Arizona are now waiting on a Supreme Court decision, a state Supreme Court decision, to decide whether that 1864 pre-territory law is the law of the land. This decision's probably going to come in the next few months. And fearing legal prosecution, providers, I've spoke to some of these providers, they've closed their doors and moved. I mean, one fortunately had a clinic in Nevada, but closed their clinics in Arizona. And hospitals are unsure whether or not they can provide care to patients who have had miscarriages. I've spoken to the CEO of the Tucson Medical Center about this specifically. Like, her doctors are standing there with patients uncertain whether or not they can provide life-saving care. And they're distraught over this. I mean, this ban is not just ripping away the right of women to make their own decisions about abortions, it is putting lives at risk in my state every day. So, Dr. Dennard, I had a question my staff prepared. I think you already answered it. I read your bio, and I see you're from Texas. So I'm interested in this SB 8, this bounty law that they have, and what the impacts are. I was in Texas not so long ago. I heard something about it on the radio, the $10,000 bounty that private citizens can claim if they file lawsuits, this private action. And I know this, I don't think this is an impact on you personally, but I'm just interested if you have any anecdotes about how it's affected anybody that you know in Texas.
It definitely has impacted me personally. I just would like anyone who's sitting here to think about how much work they've put into their careers and all the time and dedication that all of you have to be sitting here right now. And that's what every physician has done to be where they are today, taking care of patients. Hours of study, so much dedication, and we're all trying to be the best types of physicians that we can possibly be for our patients and practice standard medical care. And now in my state, I'm in a situation where I have to make a decision if I can continue practicing standard medical care or risk being thrown in jail or risk being sued. And more importantly, when I am in the privacy of my office, taking care of patients that I've known for a very long time, having open, honest communication with them about their bodies, worried about whether or not their aunt or their sister or someone might get upset that I'm talking about the scary word of abortion, because they could. They could take me to court, take my license away, take my husband's license away. So it's a very scary place to be right now as a physician, and it's created so much confusion and so much fear. Fear is paralyzing, right? It's clouded our ability to provide the type of care that we all studied and were taught to provide in our training. And now a woman who's pregnant in Texas is not receiving the same care that a woman in New York is receiving.
Same is true in Arizona.
Correct.
You know, from speaking to the CEO and other healthcare providers, they find themselves in the similar situation. I have 2 daughters and a granddaughter, and they're now growing up with fewer rights than my grandmother had.
Correct.
And we all know that this is not going to stop with Dobbs. I mean, we talked about the abortion pills. And because of all this, that's why I'm glad we continue to support and push for the Women's Health Protection Act, which could codify this. We've got a lot more work to do on that. We may have a ballot initiative on this in Arizona this year, collecting signatures right now. I spoke to one of the signature collectors a couple weeks ago, standing on a corner. Says it's going pretty well. So we hope to get it on the ballot, and that'll have a great impact for women's rights in Arizona. Because we don't want politicians making these decisions. I mean, this should be between a woman and her doctor. So let this anniversary remind us that we've got a lot more work to do. I want my granddaughter to grow up in a country where, she's valued as a person and a patient and has the same rights as women had before her. So thank you again. Senator Murray, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Senator Murray. Thank you for holding this discussion today, and thank you to our panelists for being here. Next week is the anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision in Roe versus Wade. And in the year and a half since today's extremist Supreme Court struck down Roe, millions of women across this country have had their right to control their own bodies and their own futures stripped away from them by Republican lawmakers. And as a result, many people have been forced to make choices that even a few years ago seemed unimaginable. Now, Republicans are trying to claim that the consequences of the Supreme Court's decision are overblown, that we're making too much of this. So I thought I'd ask you, Dr. Dennard, you are practicing in a state that has one of the most restrictive abortion laws. Can you tell us, do you think that the claims are overblown? Can you say a word about what it means to have stripped the right from people who need access to abortion to be able to get it?
This is not a drill. This is real. And I've lived it personally with my own body, and I live it every day as an OBGYN. So it's enormously important, and it's affecting families everywhere.
And say more about how it affects them.
Well, like I mentioned before, the amount of fear that is induced now for individuals who are considering pregnancy, considering growing their families, they come to my office, whether it's an annual exam just for a routine checkup, with questions. Some of them are too afraid to even ask me what their rights are for fear of putting me in a litigious situation.
So you don't even get the medical care you need. You can't even ask questions of your doctor for fear that either you'll be at legal risk or you'll put your doctor at legal risk.
I would like to think that some of the most intimate moments are between a physician, an OBGYN specifically, and their patient, talking about their bodies and their life. And now it's as if someone's standing in my office room telling us what we can and cannot talk about.
That is such an extraordinary invasion of government, of politicians into the examining room and the conversation that takes place between a patient and a doctor. I want to, though, talk about a different part of this, and that is we now know 20 states have done this close to all-out bans on abortion. But for just a minute, focus on the states that have not. How safe are we? And we've been talking a little bit as well about the ways that Republican politicians can take away abortion rights in all of the states that have worked very hard to protect people within their borders and provide a haven for those who need to come from a state where abortion is not available. So the question then becomes, what will the Republicans do if they have the power? And again, Republicans are trying a kind of nothing to see here, don't worry about it language right now. They want to let the states decide individually. That's how it should be. Ms. Valenti, can you speak just a little bit about what you see as Republican intentions in states that are protecting abortion and what the consequences of that will be?
they're going for an all-out ban, no exceptions at all. I think that they will try to pass off their national ban as something that allows people to get the care that they need. We know that that's not true. We know that exceptions aren't real. We see that every day. We see it with stories like Dr. Dennard's. And so I don't think that we're safe in pro-choice states at all. I don't think that we're safe now, just with the status quo, because of how overloaded doctors in pro-choice states are from out-of-state patients, right? We're already seeing a tremendous impact on care there. So as I said earlier, we don't need a national ban to be in danger. We're already in danger. But I am certainly concerned, and we know that whatever they say about compromise bans, middle ground, reasonable, all of these words that I've been tracking for the last year and a half are just complete lies. They are just a stopover to a complete and total abortion ban.
And what is it going to take to make us safe? What is it going to take to be in the place as we were before, where a patient and a doctor can have a confidential conversation about reproductive health issues, about pregnancy, about abortion? What's it going to take for that to happen?
Zero government interference in pregnancy, and the understanding that pregnancy is too complicated to legislate at any point, and there is no safe or ethical way for us to do that. And I'm sure Dr. Floyd, who works on this so much, has thoughts as well. But it's just so clear to me that there is no legislation that will ever be safe for someone's pregnancy.
Dr. Floyd, do you want to add to that?
No, I just, the response that Ms. Valenti gave is exactly the response that I was going to give. Like, what we need is to have zero political interference in the care that we're providing. None. Patients are fully equipped to be able to make complex decisions about their health and their lives. They are able to make decisions about themselves and their families in conjunction with their providers. There is absolutely no need for interference from any government policy, politician, any government interference whatsoever as they are trying to make that decision. In order for us to get to a place where our patients can have the care that they need and feel safe and have good outcomes, it means that we've got to pull the politics out of the exam room.
And the way we get politics out of this is we pass a federal law that says what happens in the examining room is up to the people who are in the examining room. That people who are pregnant are protected, that their doctors are protected, and that they make decisions together without interference from the government. That's what the Democrats want to do, and that's where we will fight the Republicans every inch of the way until we get this done. Thank you for your work you're doing on behalf of so many people who need you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Shaheen.
Well, thank you, first of all, Senator Murray, for organizing and hosting today's hearing, and thank you to all of our witnesses. It is because of women like all of you here across the country that are speaking up even when the circumstances are very challenging, that we're seeing attention and hopefully we will see action. You know, I'm old enough to remember when Roe was passed because I was out of college at the time, and I remember what it was like before the passage of Roe with my friends, and now we're back to that situation again. It used to be something that we celebrated. And to pick up on what Senator Warren talked about with respect to states, what we're seeing is that these extreme abortion bans are being pushed even in states like the state of New Hampshire, my home state, which has prided itself on being libertarian, on staying out of people's bedrooms and personal business. And what we're seeing now is that under Republican leadership, our current Republican governor instituted the first abortion ban in modern history in New Hampshire. And now there is legislation that would introduce a 15-day abortion ban. No, as all of you have spoken to so eloquently, the impact of something like a 15-day abortion ban is just so detrimental. I wonder, and you may have talked to this a little bit earlier, but Dr. Floyd or Dr. Dennard, could you all speak to what the implications are for women of a day ban, 15-day, not 15-week, 15-day ban on abortion.
There's so much to say about that.
I know, you can't.
Many women don't know when the last date of their menstrual period was. So I almost have no words to say.
I'm not even sure what a 15-day ban is. I honestly don't. 15 days from what? And as was mentioned, I mean there's absolutely the vast majority of folks do not know that they're pregnant at that point. Right. And so that you might as well say it's a total ban. Like that's just a cover for this is a total ban because that's absurd, really.
I know I think it's probably legislation that was developed by some old guy in the legislature who has no idea what women go through and what pregnancy and giving birth is all about. One of the things that I find most disturbing right now about what's happening in states is what that's doing to the ability for women to get care, because what we're beginning to see is practitioners who are leaving those states that have these really very assault, really, on women's health. So can one of you speak to what we're seeing with respect to practitioners leaving and what that's going to do to care for women? Mm-hmm. Dr. Floyd, maybe you want to start.
Sure. It's very, very, very concerning. I had mentioned a little bit earlier in my remarks that we are now, we already know that there are significant major provider shortages in some areas. And the unfortunate thing is that the same places that have these severe restrictions and these bans are the same ones that have the worst maternal outcomes. That provide the least amount of resources and support when it comes to public health insurance, when it comes to social programs that help support families. So it's all linked, right? And so when you start to see providers leaving areas and you see worsening of provider deserts, then you are hands down going to see worse health outcomes. That's what it's going to mean. And I can tell you, whether it's a provider that's already in practice or someone who is training to become a provider and looking where they're going to go, we are seeing time and time again that trainees, that learners, that residents are saying, I'm not going to go and practice in a state where I can't practice medicine the way that I want to practice it, the way that I'm training to practice it. And so again, you have them going to, avoiding those places where these bans and restrictions are, which is further worsening the provider shortage. So it's very, very scary where we are going to be ultimately when it comes to the state of provider access in these places.
I've been tracking what I'm calling the OBGYN exodus across anti-choice states. And it's remarkable and terrifying because you can see a very clear line from OBGYNs, maternal fetal medicine specialists, leaving a state. Hospitals, in turn, need to shutter their maternity wards, which in turn creates a maternal health desert, which in turn creates deaths, right? There's a very clear through line from abortion bans to people's deaths because of the way that doctors need to, understandably, leave if they don't feel safe practicing medicine. And it's happening so much quicker, I think, than anyone anticipated. In Idaho, there was a study that showed that half of the OBGYNs are either leaving or considering leaving. There are only, I think at last count, 5 maternal fetal medicine specialists left in the entire state. This is already happening. This is not something that we are in danger of in the future. The crisis is already there.
And can you talk about who gets hurt the most by that kind of exodus?
It's the most marginalized among us, right? It's people in rural communities. The New Yorker had a really incredible piece about a woman who died in Texas. She lived in a maternal a maternal health care desert. The only place she could go to was a religiously affiliated hospital that didn't even mention abortion to her, even as her pregnancy got more and more dangerous, even as it became life-threatening. And so we know who is going to die as a result of these bans, and we know who is going to be disproportionately impacted. And I think Republicans hope, because it is the most marginalized among us and because it's poor women and Black women, that voters won't care. And I hope that that's not the case.
Well, certainly to pick up again on what Senator Warren said, I don't know what happened to their idea of, the Republicans' idea of, well, we should give these decisions to the states. They're seeing that when the states are making these determinations by referendum, by votes, that the voters do care because they understand what the impact is on women. And so that's why they're trying to do a national abortion ban, because they don't want to leave it up to the states, because they know that when given the opportunity, women and men who understand what the impact is are going to oppose it. So again, thank you all very much for your fight. Thank you, Senator Murray, and to all of the people in the audience, thank you for showing up today and for continuing to advocate.
Thank you. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Senator Murray, for making this possible today. I just want to ask, and it's really open for any of you, talk to us a little bit about the impact that the Dobbs decision is really having on all the states where abortion is still legal, and states like mine that had limited infrastructure to serve our own community that are now being really having to provide services for multiple states around us as well. And so talk a little bit about that dynamic, and I'd love your thoughts as well on just the impact that, logistically, that travel is having on patients across the country.
I think one note that we haven't really discussed is what a huge impact it's having on my specialty and Dr. Floyd's specialty. The trickle-down effect of losing providers and having providers move states is that we're not training the next generation of OBGYNs to practice medicine the way that we were trained to practice medicine. And a very important element of the medical training for my specialty could become extinct, and is becoming extinct, because it's very, very hard to train someone when you haven't been trained on that yourself. So it's really impacting our specialty from the medical side as well.
Yeah, as someone who practices in an area that does have access, and we're very fortunate in that we have a lot of support here in DC to be able to continue providing care the way we are. I can tell you what it means is that there's increased demand in these places. There are higher volumes. There are delays to being able to access care. There are longer wait times. For patients, there are higher costs associated with traveling. For providers who are trying to accommodate the increases in volume that they may be seeing, it oftentimes means that you've got to relook at your schedules. You have to figure out, how do I change my workflows? How do I change my staffing model so that I have enough people to be able to take care of the patients who are coming to see? What days of the week do I need to now be open? What hours of the day do I now need to be open? And what that translates ultimately into for some places is overwhelm, absolute overwhelm. I mean, there are places who have had to open brand new centers to be able to accommodate the volume that they have coming into their areas. And because the desire is so strong to be able to help everyone that you can, anyone that you can, we're often willing to push boundaries and push our limits, both our personal limits and the limits of our teams, to be able to deliver that care.
Talk a little bit about what those delays, what does a delay in care really mean for someone?
What that delay could be will depend on where a patient's trying to go. And, honestly, depending on where they are already in the pregnancy, that delay could mean the difference between being able to get an abortion or not. It could mean the difference between being able to get a medication abortion or having to being forced to have a procedural abortion that you did not want. It means sometimes delays in care can result in procedures potentially being more complicated because someone is further along in their pregnancy, the cost most certainly goes up as they get further into a pregnancy. And so when you're delayed because you're trying to get an appointment somewhere, or even just navigate the travel, the logistics of travel to get somewhere, then by the time you get there, like you're, oftentimes in a much more difficult situation than you would have been had you been able to get the care earlier. And those delays are, again, despite the best efforts of providers who are trying to accommodate as many patients as they can.
Thank you all.
Can you speak a little bit to the emotional impact, not just the physical
Yes.
impact of delay?
Yes, and Dr. Dennard, I'm absolutely sure can speak to this as well. But for patients who, whether they made the decision to end their pregnancy because it's not the right time for them to be a parent, or because they were unfortunate to have a pregnancy that's being affected by an anomaly. Regardless of what the reason is, once you know that you need to end that pregnancy, you want to do it as soon as possible. And so when you're being forced to delay being able to get that care, the emotional and the mental toll can be tremendous. Dr. Dennard can speak very much more eloquently to that, I'm sure.
Speak. You can speak from a personal perspective.
I mean, personally, in addition to just the absolute heartbreak of finding our diagnosis and knowing that I needed an abortion, I just would like everyone in this room to think about what it's like to have a surgery from someone you've never met. Yeah. It's scary. It's very scary. And even as an OBGYN, understanding the procedure, understanding that what I was going through was, as far as my abortion, was very, very low risk and I was in safe hands, it's just absolutely terrifying.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Rosen, are you ready to ask a question, or you want? Okay, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Senator Murray, for holding this discussion, this important discussion. And I really just want to thank all of you for being here. As a woman, these are very personal moments. And to come here on camera in front of everyone, to be out there and do these things, it's important. It takes courage. It's not without risk. And I appreciate it. And for everyone who helped put this together besides Senator Murray as well. And next week would have been the 51st anniversary of Roe versus Wade decision, which protected a woman's right, of course, to make her own health care decisions. But sadly, almost 2 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court took away that right and opened the floodgates of anti-choice attacks on reproductive freedoms. As a result, we've all heard the gut-wrenching stories. We're hearing yours today. But what about the little girls who were raped and couldn't get an abortion? Of women who were miscarrying but couldn't access the care they needed? And of doctors being sued or prosecuted simply for doing their job and providing life-saving care. And we know anti-choice extreme politicians will not stop until they've passed a nationwide abortion ban, which would even ban abortion in pro-choice states like my state of Nevada. And that's why I've been fighting here in the Senate to defend women's rights to make their own medical decisions free from interference of politicians. I helped introduce the Freedom to Travel for Healthcare Act to protect a woman's right to travel across state lines and get the reproductive care they need, this critical care, this life-saving care. And that's what I'm going to ask all of you about today. I have 3 questions, Madam Chair. So, traveling for abortion, we'll start there. Dr. Floyd, Nevada's seen many women come to our state for abortion care because it's banned in their home states. These women face financial hardship and are stripped of their support system, like you spoke about, by having to travel out of state. So, Dr. Floyd, can you speak to us about the burden women face when they have to travel away from home, and why we need to proactively protect a woman's right to travel?
Yes, I think I'm going to answer that question with an illustration of another story. I took care of a patient several months ago who was a patient actually living in Louisiana. And this patient was a patient who was experiencing homelessness in Louisiana. and somehow was able to navigate connecting with an abortion fund and with individuals who could assist her with the logistics of being able to get here to DC to get the abortion that she needed. So the patient got here, I saw her, took care of her. When I was finished with her procedure, she gave me a big hug with tears in her eyes and said, "I cannot thank you enough for being here. Thank you so much for doing this for me. I am in a situation right now where I don't have a place to live. And the thought of me bringing a child into this world and going back to that situation is unimaginable. So thank you." And this patient, right after thanking me, went on to say, "You know what, I'm really excited because I actually get to stay in a hotel. Like, they put me in a hotel last night, and I get to stay in a hotel tonight, and they told me I can get room service. Because after I get on that plane to go back to Louisiana, I'm going back to being without a home." This is what it looks like. This is what it looks like.
Thank you for your kindness and for caring and for being there. I'm going to move on to Dr. Dennard, and we're going to continue on this topic. And so as a physician and as a patient in Texas, I don't have to tell anybody here, Texas has some of the strictest abortion restrictions in the country. And as someone who's had to travel out of state for care, we just heard about what happened in Louisiana, but what would have happened to you? And there's others like you, if there'd been a nationwide abortion ban in place.
I would have been forced to remain pregnant and deliver a baby that was either had already passed away in my womb or would have suffocated in my arms. That would have been the only choice for me. And as long as I was on Texas soil, that was the only choice. It really does feel like pregnancy in Texas, women don't own the pregnancy. The state owns the pregnancy.
I'm so sorry for what you've gone through, and I know you've seen it as a physician. Sorry for what you've gone through personally, and I do really appreciate you coming out to protect the women who maybe can't speak for themselves. So thank you. I have one last question about prosecuting doctors, and this is for you, Ms. Valenti. Can you speak to the impact of abortion bans, restrictions, the impact? We have two doctors here. I know they can probably talk about it too. The impact they have on doctors, specifically OBGYNs, where they feel comfortable practicing. And what are these restrictions doing either to drive people away from the specialty, drive people away for certain locations, and how does that affect women's just women's health care in general for all of us, whatever state you're in? Can you speak to that? I know you've been working on those things.
We spoke a little bit about the exodus of OBGYNs out of anti-choice states, and I think that is one of the biggest issues that I'm concerned about. But for the OBGYNs and the maternal fetal medicine specialists and any doctor who might need to perform an abortion, for those that stay in anti-choice states, they are quite literally taking their freedom in their hands, every decision that they make with a patient, and that is no way to practice medicine. We've seen the impact of that in terms of delays, fears if you perform an abortion, if you give a certain kind of care, that you could be prosecuted. And we're not just talking about the prosecution of doctors too, and I know we all know that, but I just want to mention it as well. You mentioned miscarriage treatment and the way that some women haven't been able to get it, it's been delayed. We're not just in a situation right now where someone is going to be afraid that they can't get treatment for their miscarriage, but that they might be arrested if they do. We just saw a case in Ohio, Brittany Watts, a woman who was denied care, denied a miscarriage treatment at a religious institution, went home to have her miscarriage, and then was arrested for abuse of a corpse. Right. And that's the future I think that we can expect to see for all Americans if a national ban was to pass. It's not just about doctors going to jail, it's about anyone going to jail who has any sort of role in abortion whatsoever. And I think that we should all be terrified. This is something that is obviously disproportionately impacting doctors, but also patients and anyone who cares about this issue.
And even a healthy pregnancy, deliveries can be fraught with danger. So if we don't have qualified medical professionals everywhere to help with what are hopefully uneventful pregnancies and healthy deliveries, this is still going to impact the limiting of OBGYNs wherever they are, whatever state they are, because they're fearful, is going to eliminate care in all circumstances. Would you agree with that too?
Yes, I think
It's going to put us all at risk.
It puts us all at risk. I think doctors are rightfully fearful, and I think patients are rightfully fearful. You know, after a case like Brittany Watts, how many people won't go get that miscarriage treatment, right? How many people will just decide, you know what, I may be bleeding a lot, but I'm not going to go to the hospital because I don't know what's going to happen there. And so it really is a nightmare situation for everyone who's involved. And I think what's so troubling to me as someone who, you know, covers this issue from a, you know, journalistic and political lens is to watch Republicans call themselves the party of family values while trying to prevent people from leaving their home states for care, trying to pass travel bans, and calling them trafficking laws, and incentivizing, as they do in Texas, incentivizing families turning each other in, right? So that you're too afraid to even tell a family member about the care that you may need to get out of state. I profiled a young woman in Texas, 21 years old. Her fetus did not develop at all above the neck. There was no head. This fetus was not going to survive. She had to go to New Mexico for care, and she did not tell one single person. It was just her and her boyfriend, 21 years old. And when they made the call to the New Mexico clinic, he said, it felt as if I was robbing a bank. That's how bad and scary it felt to him to make this call. And they were too terrified to tell anyone. And so the isolation of that just continues to strike me every day.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate you holding this.
Thank you. Senator Bennett.
Thanks, Patty. Thank you, Jackie. It's good to see you. It's nice to see all of you. Thank you very much for coming. It's difficult around here when you have a hearing and all the people are going in and out. I can't imagine what it's like to spend a whole morning here having people come in and out, so I apologize. I actually am going to try to ask you something just based on what, Jessica, you were talking about a second ago, which was not what I was planning on asking you, but I'm sure somebody else has covered it. First of all, thank you for being here, and I'm grateful on behalf of all of Colorado that you're here. Our state was the first state in America to decriminalize abortion. That was, I think, maybe even 40 years before Roe versus Wade. We were the first state to codify Roe versus Wade after Roe versus Wade was enacted by the Supreme Court, and we were the first state after Dobbs to reaffirm our commitment to Roe versus Wade. Interestingly, that's had an effect on Colorado. We have now, we've doubled, the number of abortions in our state has doubled as a result of this. 30% of the people that are getting abortions in Colorado are from out of state because people are seeking a refuge from states like the ones you just described, Jessica, and the ones, doctors, you've been talking about today. That has not been without cost to patients because the delay is increasing and increasing and increasing in terms of time as the number of people rises because they're not able to access care in their own states. And you were mentioning that, you know, these Republican states where people are saying one thing and doing another, including the state of Texas, where there are people, I mean, the sort of vigilante system of having neighbors spy on neighbors is something that's just unimaginable where I come from. I mean, we would never stand for it in Colorado. But now you're starting to see changes. I'm sure you've talked about what happened in Ohio this fall, you know, and that's a red state. And in an off-year election, the citizens of Ohio, led I think by doctors, went to the ballot and asked whether or not this should be that a woman's right to choose should be enshrined in the Constitution. The voters in Ohio said yes, we should put it in the Constitution. The governor of Florida signed a 6-week abortion ban in Florida, and now you're seeing that Floridians are saying, we've seen what's going to happen in Ohio, or what happened in Ohio. Now we have a chance to do it in Florida. I wonder whether you could just build on what you were talking about when I came in here to talk about what the actual political reality is in these red states where people are beginning to overcome the restrictions on freedom and the restrictions on people's health care that their elected officials have put in place.
I think this is where abortion is very much a democracy issue. I'm so glad that the people of Ohio were able to make their voices heard despite many, many attacks on democracy leading up to that vote. Voters want abortion to be legal, even in red states. The Florida ballot measure that you mentioned is supported by 60% of Republicans in the state. And we are seeing numbers like that across the country. People can see very, very clearly what abortion bans are doing to their communities, what abortion bans are doing to their families, and they don't want that, right? They don't want that for their communities or their families. If voters are actually allowed to have a direct say, I think that they will make what they believe very, very clear. My concern is that they won't have that direct say because there have been so many attacks on democracy in states that are putting forward pro-choice ballot measures, anything to keep voters from having a say on abortion at all, because they know what's going to happen. They know that when abortion is put directly to voters, that voters support abortion rights. And so I've said earlier, as we talk about this as a healthcare issue, as a freedom issue, we need to be talking about this as a democracy issue. And if Republicans really believe that the legislation they're pushing is something that their voters want, prove it. Let your voters have a say, and let's see what happens.
I don't know, doctors, if anybody else has a comment, I'm happy to. Or you?
I agree.
Good. I would say that in that case, it's quite amazing because this isn't just sort of some philosophical discussion about democracy. And the reality is in Ohio, what they tried to do was put on the ballot something that said, instead of having referenda pass with just a majority vote, we're going to say that you've got to have a supermajority vote of the people to overturn something that the legislature has done. That's what we're going to say in order to change the law in Ohio. And Ohioans said, forget that. You know, this is a democracy. And if we have 50%, that should be good enough. But they had to win that battle first, which they did, before they went on to actually have this a battle in, as I mentioned, an off-year election. I think that took a lot of courage to say, not only are we going to deal with that assault on democracy you're talking about, but then to say we're going to put this ballot issue here, not in a presidential election, not in an election when we know we're going to have this massive turnout, but in an off-year election because it's that important to the people of Ohio that we're going to do it. And I'm proud to represent Colorado. I'm glad to be here. But what's important to me about this is that's a red state. That's a big red state in the middle of the country. And I think you're going to see other places do this as well. And the question I think for us in Washington is, what can we do not to just to hold the line here, but to make sure that we enshrine these matters as a matter of federal law and constitutional law again. And none of us, I'm sure Patty, the least of all of us, believed that in our lifetimes we'd be fighting for rights that, as our friend John Tester from Montana says, he may have said this already today, but he says, my daughter didn't have to fight for, or my daughter never had to fight for because her grandmother won these battles. Well, here we are again, which is just reminds us how important it is. So thank you again for being here. And Patty, thank you for, as always, leading on this issue and organizing us to be here as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We have several other senators that are going to be here in a few minutes, but I wanted to turn to you again, Ms. Valenti, because you've really tracked that anti-abortion groups and Republicans are trying to sort of change medical and legal and political language to hide their extremism, like efforts to do away with the word ban. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about the other terms that you're tracking that you think is important for us to pay attention to?
Sure. So ban was really interesting because there really was this concerted effort to not just have anti-abortion activists stop using the word ban, but to pressure journalists to stop using the word ban and to say that the word ban was somehow inaccurate or biased. And so it was thankfully, it seems to have been an unsuccessful campaign, but they worked very, very hard at that. The thing that I'm tracking most right now and that I'm most concerned about is the way that they are trying to change medical terminology and medical language. So we've talked a lot today about non-viable pregnancies. Anti-abortion activists are creating legislation where this is already in some states' legislation and putting out policy papers and putting out guidance, asking doctors to not call these pregnancies non-viable pregnancies, but to call them potentially life-limiting. They want to erase the term non-viable. When it comes to life-saving abortions, they don't want those called abortions at all. They want them called maternal-fetal separation procedures because they are trying to divorce abortion from healthcare entirely and give credibility to this idea that abortion is never necessary to save someone's health or life. And so again and again, and you will see sprinklings of it in state bans, in legislation, where this language is starting to come in.
In the actual
legislation,
language?
maternal fetal medicine, maternal fetal separation procedure is in multiple pieces of legislation. I would have to check which states. Potentially
what does that
life.
mean? Maternal fetal.
It means abortion, right? It just means
It doesn't
abortion.
mean anything.
It doesn't mean anything. It means abortion, but they don't want to use the word abortion when it's someone who they believe deserves an abortion. Right? They want to use a different term for that. And the same thing is true for non-viable. And this sort of gets at the other thing that I've been tracking, which is their effort to do away with exceptions for non-viable pregnancies and to do away with prenatal testing so that women will never know that that pregnancy is not viable to begin with.
To actually ban prenatal testing?
Yes, they are going
Which
after.
I'm assuming that you use in your practices.
Every day. They're doing that in two ways. Like one is in the same way that they are going after the FDA over mifepristone regulations. They're going after prenatal testing regulations for the FDA.
So women would have the knowledge of what they need? When
Or if they do get the prenatal tests, then they want to require, in the same way that doctors often in anti-choice states have to read a script about fake abortion complications or fake dangers of abortion, that they will have to read fake statistics about how prenatal testing is not at all accurate and you can't trust this and you don't want to have an abortion with a healthy pregnancy. And so really it's about tricking and misleading people who are in oftentimes the most vulnerable point in their lives.
Wow, thank you. We've been joined by several of the senators. Senator Welsh, you were here first. I'm going to go to you.
Well, I'll defer to my senior colleague here, Chairman. Yeah, you can go first. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Welsh. Thank you, Senator Murray, so much for holding this very, very important hearing, and thank you for your strong advocacy here. As you know, our state has been greatly impacted. When you look at a map and you look at regions of the country that no longer have service, Washington next door to Idaho is like we're the island of any kind of relief. So it's not surprising to see that we've seen a 56% increase in the amount of patients coming to Planned Parenthood clinics from Idaho over the last year, a 56% increase. So we ask ourselves, how can we continue to provide great care in general if that many people are coming to Washington? And as some of you know, we've also been concerned, even though Washington has a law protecting providers, we literally are a community across those borders. What happens to physicians that actually live in Idaho, who practice at Planned Parenthood clinics, and then go back to Idaho? What kind of protections exist for them? What kind of protections exist for Planned Parenthood, who already has massive amount of security demands put on it to have the level of security to provide care at that Spokane site, and have had increased insurance charges and everything else? How do we continue to provide for the care and safety of those that are doing an incredible job in providing access to care? So I don't know who wants to take that.
Yeah, so I think, you know, it's what we as in a 56% increase is a considerable increase, right? And one of the things that I know I've seen from colleagues across the country is when you can, to some extent, anticipate what may be coming, you can perhaps better plan for it. And then when you're not able to anticipate, or when what you're seeing is much more than what you had originally planned for, that's where we often call upon other members of our community. One thing I can say about the abortion provider community is that we are a pretty tightly knit group. And whether we are talking about a patient who is needing to receive care at a Planned Parenthood or a patient who is needing to be seen at an independent clinic, we are at a point where we are constantly collaborating, working together. We have patient navigation systems that will allow for a provider anywhere to call a patient navigator and say, I have a patient who needs to get XYZ. And if this other place can't accommodate them, then the next step is to look to see, okay, where else can we get this person for them to be able to get timely care? So whether it's working together with the scheduling and logistics to working together on this funding support, the financial support to get patients where they need to go, I think the key is that we are really working hard to plan, to be prepared, and in cases where we can't quite plan or be prepared, working to collaborate and see how can we pull on other resources from within our abortion community to make sure that our patients are getting the care that they need.
Well, my point is that it is impacting care in general. And so to say that, states are doing their own thing, they're not doing their own thing. They're impacting other states. And it wasn't that long ago, definitely within the last several years, that the Planned Parenthood clinic in Pullman, Washington, just south of the Spokane clinic by an hour, was bombed. Wow. And so we're talking about real security issues, we're talking about real impacts, we're talking about real lives, right, and people who are trying to provide care. But right there on the Washington-Idaho border is the epicenter of this discussion about how people are being impacted, how people can still provide care, how their clinics are being impacted by cost and increase in demand. So we are being impacted. We have to do more. We have to have a federal law to protect people. That's the best way that we can do to get care. So thank you for that, and I'll look forward to following up with you.
If I could add something about clinic security, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We're seeing such an increase in violence and harassment against providers and clinics, and I just want to point out that one of the growing trends in the anti-abortion movement is attacking buffer zone laws and claiming that they are a violation of free speech rights. And so it's so important that we're paying attention to this because they are desperate to let anti-abortion activists who are harassing patients, screaming at patients, throwing things at patients, get closer and closer to them and to do away with any buffer of safety that patients and providers had.
Well, in this case, they built a church down the street called the Church of Planned Parenthood, hoping to confuse people. And so this is, Spokane is at the epicenter of this debate, and Washington is doing its best to provide care. But it is not without strain, and it's not without challenge. So thank you.
I think another thing to mention that we haven't really spoken about, and Dr. Floyd, I'm sure you can speak to this, is the amount of provider burnout that we're at risk of having now. Imagine, I always say it's been more traumatic for me to be an OBGYN in Texas than it really was for me, myself, to go out of state and have my own abortion. As sad as that is to say, I feel burnout from being in a place where care is not available, but physicians like Dr. Floyd are seeing such an influx of patients. It can affect your mental health. And providers need to be able to take care of themselves so that they can take care of their patients. I can't even fathom as an OBGYN what your day is like every day, Dr. Floyd.
Yeah, thank you for making that comment. I think, that is such an important point, right? Burnout in medicine in general is a huge problem right now. When you talk about people who are constantly having to do battle on a day-to-day basis, the level of stress, the level, amount of overwhelm, the anxiety, when we're talking about the potential risk as a provider of potential criminalization, of the possibility that you yourself, by just trying to do your job, could be taken from your family, put in prison, be fined ridiculous amounts of money. Yes, the stress is very real. And just to to kind of go back to what you were mentioning before about how to, how to address like the increasing need and the fact that it's straining capacity. This is where we need federal legislation, right? Like we know that there is federal legislation that is being proposed. This is where we need to have wins in the Supreme Court. This is where, we need for there to be victories that will help to give us not only just a little bit of a release on the pressure valve, but also momentum to keep going with the fight. We need to be able to look forward to say, okay, you know what? This might be a small win, but this small win, we're going to take it because it's going to keep us going. And yes, it's hard and we're strained and our capacity is at its max, but we know that we've got those who are willing to fight for us on multiple different levels so that we don't have to be like, it doesn't have to be like this forever.
Thank you. Senator Welsh.
Yeah, thank you, and thank everyone, Senator Murray. We're fortunate in Vermont. Our legislature passed, enshrined the right of freedom of choice, freedom, bodily autonomy, Roe v. Wade, essentially, in our Constitution. The governor, totally supportive, Republican governor, Democratic legislature. Our U.S. Supreme Court has totally failed us. And in the name of, quote, state rights, where the decision will be back to the state, it took away the freedom an individual had to make her own decision. And there was peace, there was conflict, but relative peace after Roe, because the question of abortion, very contentious, is never going to go away. But it set a baseline where you could make your own decision. A woman could make her own decision. What's been unleashed with this Supreme Court decision is a rapid politicization, because where is now is back to each state to make a decision. The way I see it and hear from you, the way it's playing out, is that folks who have a point of view against that right of a woman to make her own decision, to be free to do that, they believe they can use the political process to impose their will on others. That's what's happened. And that's why I'm in total agreement that we need a federal standard. As much as women who led the effort in Vermont to provide this right in Vermont, they don't think the right to make the decision should be based on what zip code you live in or what state you live in. So maybe just a comment about how much heartache and how much pain and how much anxiety it is, especially for providers. I mean, it's like it's criminalizing making medical decisions as opposed to in getting politicians in the middle of that medical decision that you have to make, even when it's about health and safety. Can the doctors here comment on that?
I had a patient that I took care of right after Roe fell who had a twin pregnancy. And we were just so delighted that she was pregnant again. I had taken care of her in her prior pregnancy, and one of her twins was diagnosed with trisomy 18, which is a fatal diagnosis. And on top of the heartache of going through something like that with a patient that you know well and have taken care of for a long time, the walking on eggshells, the jumping through hoops, what we had to do to get her care was salt in the wound, really.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dr. Floyd?
Yeah, I think when we have these, conversations about, particularly when I think about risk, right? When we think about kind of how risk plays out with those who are providing care, and I think about myself as a provider, but my colleagues, but then also my team members, right? Like, because we don't do this alone. Like, as providers, like, we can't do any of the work that we do without our teams that support us. So when we are having to navigate these challenges of figuring out how we're going to potentially continue practicing in the face of certain levels of risk, we're not just making those decisions for ourselves, we're making those decisions for our team members. And the threat is real, right? Mm-hmm. Like, the concerns are real. And so trying to make sure that we are, I've had colleagues, I know of places, practices that have started to limit the type of care and the amount of care that they're willing to provide because of that concern over that risk. to say, you know what, we're not going to see patients from X state, or we're not going to see patients from X state who need medication abortion because they would need to, potentially end up taking the medications back to their home state. And then what is that going to mean for the patient, or what might it mean for us too? So the decisions that are being made around how to continue to work in these environments, how to continue to sustain ourselves in these environments are difficult. And again, they contribute to, to the burnout, to the level of stress that we're all feeling right now. But I will finish by saying that there is resilience, right? Like, we are a resilient group, and time again, we've shown that.
I would love to say something as a patient, from a patient perspective. I don't talk about this story a lot, but my 13-year-old daughter is here, and when I was pregnant with her, I got very, very sick during my pregnancy. I developed something called HELP syndrome, and so it's a deadly condition, and so my daughter was born 3 months early. And so when I had an unintended pregnancy, when she was a toddler, we had to make this decision: how much risk am I willing to take with my life when I have a toddler at home? And it wasn't a situation where my life was immediately at risk, right? Those are a lot of the stories that we're hearing. It was about 50-50, they told me. The idea of having some sort of government intrusion in that moment that was so difficult and so personal and so much about my family and my daughter and her ability to have a mother as she grew up is unthinkable. And I think about that abortion a lot, because I think about what it would mean to live in a place like Texas where someone would say, well, you're not sick yet, right? Your blood pressure isn't high yet. You don't need a liver transplant yet. And at what point it would have been okay for me to get care. And it's just such an unthinkable cruelty to do that to someone who is in the middle of a decision like that. And I think that the more we can bring it back to that cruelty, the better. There's a reason that Republicans want to talk about this issue as 6 weeks versus 15 weeks versus 20 weeks, because they don't want to hear stories like Dr. Dennard's, because they don't want to hear about the real life impact that these bans are making.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Rono.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, Senator Murray, and thank you all for being here. The word that comes to mind in the wake of the Dobbs decision is chaos throughout the country, and in states where abortion is permitted, such as Hawaii, which was the first state in the country to decriminalize abortion before Roe, and all across the country. So states that permit abortion, that limit abortion, that where abortion is legal, chaos abounds. So I am trying to think of any other kind of medical procedure where someone's life may be at stake, where it's not the doctor and the patient that gets to make those decisions, but suddenly lawyers have to get involved. I can't think of any other procedure in a state like Texas where being an abortion provider is a criminal thing. That I'd like to hear a little bit more about what happens when the lawyers have to tell the doctors when you can intervene to save the life of the mother-to-be. What happens? And every state probably has different standards that they go by before a medical intervention can occur to save the life of a woman. Anybody want to tell me about that?
The short answer is unnecessary and extremely dangerous delays, right? And we were talking about Brittany Watts, her case earlier. This is a woman out of Ohio who was denied miscarriage treatment at a religious institution, and then went on to miscarry at home, and then was arrested for miscarrying at home with an abuse of a corpse charge. She had been waiting at that hospital for hours and hours because the hospital lawyers were consulting with the doctors, and they were trying to figure out what the law was, and they were trying to figure out, they knew that this pregnancy was not viable. They knew that this pregnancy was going to end. But because they didn't know what to do and they had to sit there and have these conversations with lawyers, this woman had to go and miscarry at home. And I think that is the kind of situation we're going to see over and over again, and we're going to see deaths as a result of that. We're already seeing deaths. It's unthinkable, and yet it's happening.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that point, when you, as a provider, as a physician, when I'm told that I cannot intervene and deliver the care that I know how to deliver to save the life of the patient who is in front of me, who I know needs what I can provide, that is an unimaginable feeling. I have known multiple colleagues who've been in exactly that situation, who have been told by lawyers, you can't treat this patient because we have to figure out what this law means and what the impact is going to be, not just on you, but on the hospital system. We have to figure out how your intent to deliver care is going to have a broader impact. Whereas for me as a provider, all I'm worried about is that patient who's right in front of me. So it's infuriating.
It takes the focus away from the person who needs care the most, which is the patient.
So this kind of resorting to the lawyers for the hospital or the clinic or whatever, as to whether or not medical intervention can occur, do you see this occurring in the way it's occurring more and more in any other kind of situation?
No.
I think that's another important element to the chaos created by Dobbs, that this is particularly a situation that occurs with people who have babies, and it just goes to show how it's amazing to me that a bunch of politicians can enact all these laws and still want to do a nationwide abortion ban that impinges on our right to make decisions about our own bodies. And I can't think of any other kind of circumstance in which there's this kind of political intervention to stop us from being able to exercise what we thought was a constitutional right for almost 50 years. So I'm trying to think of any other kind of circumstance where this happens, but it happens to women. I wonder why in this country where we still don't provide for child care and all of those things. So I was curious about what happens, and I'm told that maternal care is something that, and even an ability to know how to perform an abortion, is a part of residency that is required. And in a state like California, not California, in Texas, where abortion is illegal, if you're in medical training there, your residency in Texas, you have to go to another state to get that part of training. Is that correct?
Well, I'm far enough away from residency now that I'm not training residents, but I had the opportunity as a resident in Texas to get trained in abortion care through the help of Planned Parenthood, actually. So thank you. That is not the case for residents now.
Yeah, it is a common occurrence that residents and even those who are in fellowship and advanced training, that they are often having to seek out programs in outside states to be able to get the training that they need in certain skills. So yes, it's absolutely a reality. I get emails and calls all the time from folks who are wanting to come to work at our Planned Parenthood because they can't get the experience and learn the knowledge that the skills that they need at home.
So is this kind of requirement having to go out of state? 22 states limit or prohibit abortions altogether. If you're in residency in those states, you have to get this training outside of the state. So is this something that gives people pause about where they want to do their residency?
Absolutely.
I think there's already been some numbers showing a decreased interest in residencies in anti-choice states, and unfortunately a decreased interest in being an OBGYN altogether. And so there is a lot of fear that we're going to lose potential providers. And I think it's also worth noting that a lot of these residents who have to travel out of state for this training have to do so at their own expense. They're paying out of pocket for the lodging, for the travel. And it's not so easy to learn something away from your regular teachers while you're not at home, while you're staying in a hotel room. It says something about the kind of care that we're creating. I'm so grateful to these doctors and residents that they are traveling and getting the training that they need, but it's not adequate, right? Like, that's not adequate training. You want someone who has been given adequate training in their home state where they're comfortable with the teachers that they're comfortable with, where they're not feeling the stress of having to travel and pay out of pocket.
So I think that that is another aspect of what followed the Dobbs decision. Of course, all the millions of people in our country who no longer can control our own bodies. But these aspects, and I think, Ms. Valenti, you are very, very much focusing on some of these what might be deemed unintended consequences. Thank you.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you. And I want to start by thanking Senator Murray for convening this important discussion, and to all of you. Thank you for your powerful testimony. I was listening to the live streaming before I got here, and I know we've covered a lot of territory, but I do want to thank you for your voices and for sharing your experiences. I'm fortunate to come from the state of Maryland. Back in 1991, we codified Roe v. Wade as a matter of Maryland law. I ran for the House of Delegates that year on this choice team, and we changed the law. And since then, Maryland's been very protective of women's reproductive rights. And in fact, since the Dobbs decision, we've seen an influx of patients from out of state. Dr. Floyd, thank you. Thank you for what you and Planned Parenthood of Metropolitan Washington are doing. Planned Parenthood of Maryland also doing a lot of this important work on behalf of women in need. So thank you. And I think it's very important that the public understand what these states are doing, because we know that the ultimate goal is to impose these bans and these structures nationally through federal legislation. So it's really important to dig into how exactly they impact women's reproductive health and health care. It's also why it's so important that we pass the Patient Protection Act. But I do want to dig down a little deeper, Ms. Valenti, and you've gone into this, this sort of gray area in laws like Texas, right, where Kate Cox was ultimately forced to go out of state. As I understand it, under Texas law, there's no provision that extends an exception to the ban for fatal fetal abnormalities. And then the calculation, as you said, I think, is that it has to be a danger to the health or serious risk of substantial impairment. Can you talk about how, and I would like Dr. Dennard, maybe as a practicing physician, also to talk about this in a practical way, but the kind of decisions, I know you've written about this and you've spoken a little bit about it today, but some examples of exactly how hard it is to navigate these exceptions. And you have to sort of prove that you're literally on your deathbed, which obviously is subject to all sorts of interpretation.
Yeah, in this way, I would say it's not a gray area at all, right? It's very black and white. These were exceptions, and I usually say so-called exceptions because exceptions don't really exist, because if you can't use them in practice, they're not real. These are exceptions that were written deliberately to exclude people, not to include people, right? And so they are trying to make it as difficult as possible for people to get care. As you said, in Texas, there's no exception for fetal abnormalities. And again, it's worth mentioning that the federal 15-week compromise ban that Republicans are pushing also has no such exception. That's what they're calling a middle ground. And so I'm not a doctor, I'm sure the doctors can speak to this, but to ask doctors to know when exactly is the point a person's life is imminently at risk is absurd. And we've seen the consequences of that, right? Like we've seen patients going septic. So you have to let someone go septic before they're allowed to get care. It's such a cruelty, and it's such a nightmare for patients and doctors alike, because we know what these patients need, right? Doctors know what patients need. They know what kind of care that they need and deserve, and they're being prevented from giving it, and quite literally killing women in the process.
Dr. Dennard.
I would just echo what Mrs. Valenti has said. It's a situation that I, as a physician, never thought I would ever be in. I do not have a law degree. I have a medical degree, and I know what is best for my patients. Definitely know what conversations we need to be having. But at this point in my state, it's much more productive for me to help a patient find care out of state than it is to try to obtain care in my own state.
Thank you. Dr. Floyd.
Yeah, I think the crucial question is what constitutes being sick enough, right? And I think Mrs. Valenti raised a really important point that there's no definitive line that's like, okay, once you cross this, then you're sick enough. It's okay in this instance. I think the other important thing to recognize is that even when a provider does determine that a patient is sick enough, the hospital system they're within, the ethics committee, the lawyers, they have to meet. So even though I, in my clinical judgment, may have said, you know what, this patient needs X, Y, Z, I'm being overridden by those who have zero experience, zero training, zero knowledge in medicine because they're having to follow laws that have been passed in their state.
Thank you all. It's a cruel system, as you all said, and leading to deaths. And thank you all for being here so we can work to change it.
Thank you. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman Murray, for doing this, and thank you to the doctors who are here. I'll just echo what Chris just said and reference the letter from Dr. Beth Cronin, who's from the Rhode Island Section Chair from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. She says, we have colleagues around the country who are pausing when caring for patients with hemorrhage, severe infection, or sepsis, as you mentioned, Doctor, ectopic non-viable pregnancies, and severe maternal complications out of fear that they will be breaking a law and putting their medical license at risk. These delays in care put patients' lives at risk. We need to be able to care for patients having complications of pregnancy. It is crucial that all physicians are able to provide evidence-based care for their patients, regardless of which state they live in. And hearing from these doctors about, like Maryland, Rhode Island is protected and safe, but hearing from these doctors about the experiences of their colleagues in your profession in states in which they're facing that danger and facing that fear and facing those delays and facing what it means for endangered patients was a very telling experience for me. The only other thing that I'd like to add is that this sort of law-based violence against women in the care of an obstetrician goes back to a very long history of violence against women seeking this kind of care. And we certainly had that in Rhode Island. For years, you had to run a gauntlet of threatening objectors and individuals just in order to get into the door of Planned Parenthood. And at one point, the toxic nature of the hatred and antipathy of these women got so bad that an individual went up to Boston and shot and killed an employee in a clinic, and then went on to another clinic in the Boston area and shot and killed that individual. I was the U.S. attorney at the time, so it was quickly reported to me, and I called our Planned Parenthood clinic and said, how are you doing? And they said, well, we got no problem here, but we also have nobody here. So I was the U.S. attorney. I called the U.S. Marshal, Marshal Jack Layden. I said, Jack, you got to get people over there and make sure that nothing goes wrong in our facility. And he said, well, I can't really do that. We're not authorized to do that. I said, well, are you authorized to protect me? He said, I'm definitely authorized to protect you. And he said, are you authorized to have marshals protect you? And he said, yeah, I'm definitely authorized to do that. I said, okay, let's you and I go. So we drove over and stood out in front of that clinic until the rest of the marshal service could gather and the Providence police could come and assemble. And as it turns out, the shooter drove right by the highway, just a couple hundred yards away from the building, on his way to ultimately being arrested down in Virginia. But that is the atmosphere out of which all of this comes. And I just wanted to call that back because there's a good deal of attention from the far right and in right-wing media about the threat of violence from people who want to protect women's rights here. And let me just say that has not been my experience. That has not been our record. That has not been our history. And there are several bodies to prove it, from extremists who committed murders in order to threaten this basic right. So thank you very much for all of you being here.
Senator Klobuchar.
Well, I may be the last one, so, and as they say in the Senate, everything's been said, but I haven't said it. So I want to thank Senator Murray for her incredible leadership. I was just over with Secretary Becerra, who brought together a number of House members and myself to talk about what's going on. And I was noticing how, while we know there's 14 states that have put in abortion bans, a lot of talk about Texas, which with everything from the mifepristone original case with the ban to the allowing people to sue each other, to the ban, the limits on emergency care. And someone referred to it as the laboratory of bad ideas when it comes to reproductive care. But I think one of the things, and I'll ask you this, Dr. Dennard and Ms. Valenti, it's just that how we connect so that people understand in these states that right now are protected, like my own, their rights are protected, that how a national abortion ban could affect everyone, not just in the states that are currently have these bans in place, and how you connect the experiences of your patients and what you're hearing from them just with what's going on at the U.S. Supreme Court, and if they see that connection.
Yeah, I think some patients are very aware of what's going on, and some patients are not. I think we're all in our own echo chambers of information as well this day and age. But a national abortion ban would just be an absolute living nightmare.
Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Dr. Floyd, we have seen in our state, because we're in a, what we'll call a tough reproductive rights neighborhood, with North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, and then Wisconsin has an old law that still has some relevance. We've seen a 40% increase in reproductive care cases that have come in abortion cases in our state, and patients coming in. It's kind of an incredible number when you think about it, and it's not because we suddenly limited birth control. In fact, we made that easier. And so what are you seeing? It's kind of the flip side. You want people to be able to get health care where they are, so you don't have sudden surges in certain states. A little harder to get to Hawaii. But talk about that and that issue for some of the states that are seeing the surges as opposed to allowing patients to get the health care where they need it.
Yeah, I mean, the surges are real and they're significant, and they are, the strong desire by the centers and the providers in those areas, and the willingness to accept and to add and to see as many patients as they can, is absolutely stressing to capacity what they and their teams are able to do. I think the other really important thing to mention is that it is also having significant effects for those who live in those areas. Mm-hmm. So it's those that are traveling to the areas needing care, but because the care is those visits are being booked up and that care is being taken up by those traveling, that means that those who are local are now having to go further and further out to get the care that they need. Mm-hmm. And so the impacts are significant. Obviously, for those having to travel, it's huge. I mean, the navigating logistics, overcoming the barriers and the obstacles are mm-hmm. huge. But there are also the issues for those who are on the ground in those places.
And are there other states, examples that have seen even more than 40%? I don't know what the answer to this is. I just know our own state.
Yeah, well, I think we just heard 56%. I can't remember which state that was.
Washington.
Washington, right. Mm-hmm. Illinois, I know, is seeing huge
mm-hmm.
influx. So pretty much the states that are on the borders of the states that have the bans are where the greatest influx is happening.
Got it.
So
all right.
Mexico.
It's just an interesting way to think about this, that it is affecting the states that don't have the bans as well. So.
It's also worth thinking about the the patients that are traveling, that are going to those states, when you mentioned Illinois, are often the patients with the most complicated pregnancies and who need the most complicated care. You know, in Illinois, they had to set up a whole system in order to have intake for all of the complicated cases that were coming their way, because those are the people who are not getting abortion medication shipped to them, but who are going to get that procedural abortion out of state.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Patty.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. I really want to thank all of our panelists for sitting through this and sharing amazing personal stories and telling us what's really happening in the world. We all need to be aware of that. So thank you so much for your time. This has been a really powerful discussion. I want to thank all of my co-hosts, Senators Schumer, Stabenow, Klobuchar, Baldwin, Warren, and Cortez Masto, and all the senators who came today. You know, I know Republicans seem pretty intent on avoiding this important conversation, but I think that we're not going to let them whistle past the graveyard that they spent a long time digging. So I want all of you to know we're going to keep the spotlight on the horrific fallout that we are seeing from the dangerous abortion bans that are being enacted. And we're going to keep lifting up the stories, because that is the best way for people to understand this isn't about someone else. It could absolutely be about you or someone you love. And I think a lot of people's lives have been turned upside down and put in serious jeopardy because Republican politicians decided it was their place to control women's health care decisions and force them to stay pregnant against their will. I want you to know we're going to keep fighting to make sure that we go to a place where women can make their own health care choices with their doctor, and not with, as you described, Dr. Dennard, someone in the room with you when you have to make those decisions. This is an important fight, and we're all in it. So thank you very much to everyone who was here. And again, thank you to our amazing panelists.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Can't tell you how much I've been
Thank you so much,
here.
Senator Murray, for hosting this event. Thank you to the panelists for being here and indulging the media after already being here for a few hours. My question, this is maybe primarily for Ms. Valenti. When we think about Republican policy, obviously all of like discussing a national abortion ban, a tax on the Crestone, but what are you thinking about as it relates to potential executive action